going on, guys? It's Brandon here, Brothers of Merit. I got Taylor with me as usual. What's up, brother?
What's up, brother? How's it going, man?
It's going good. Going good. How are you?
Good. Can't complain.
So we got Jesse Schuman to interview tonight. He is the E-Group and Outreach Director at Elevation Church down there in North Carolina. So it was a great interview. We loved it. But, before we get into it, the routine housekeeping.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to take us through some routine housekeeping, which this week is pretty simple. First and foremost, as always, we just want to say thank you. Again, I feel like this is becoming a broken record, but the support that we're seeing is awesome, and we can't thank you guys enough for sharing it with your friends, for liking us on Facebook, for finding us on Instagram, for rating and reviewing us on iTunes. That's huge. With that, if you haven't already, come try to find us on Instagram. That's at brothers_of_merit. That's where we're going to have all of our information for giveaways like our giveaway with Charles Causey that we just had last week. We have some really big giveaways coming, so just stay tuned for that. Stay woke, stay alert and everything like that. Super, super big one coming.
Oh, yeah.
So go follow us on Instagram and you'll be able to find out about that. If you're a man, join our Facebook group. It's getting a lot of traction, a lot of really, really super encouraging stuff. I find myself like every night going home and telling my wife like none of the details, but just like this was awesome. Like I just feel like I have been filled up from it. So it's been awesome. So if you're a man, come find us on Facebook and find us on Instagram to get that more information.
Absolutely. So Jesse Schuman, as I said, he's the E-Group, director down at Elevation Church in North Carolina, Steve Furtick's church. And he was just an amazing interview. He talked about things that were just, his whiteboard concept, which you guys will hear. And that is actually something Taylor and I took out of it. Just writing things down on a whiteboard, just to keep you accountable and to keep you, trying to do things and doing the right way. And we loved it. So I think Taylor and I talked, and we're going to implement it. And I hope you guys do as well. I hope you guys can take away from it and try that out and see if it helps you. So
yeah, absolutely. He was awesome. I can't overstate enough how sick this interview is. He was just throwing heaters the whole time. His story's awesome. The way that God's just redeemed and come into his life is just amazing. So you guys are in for a good one. So strap in and get ready.
Heck yeah. All right, let's sign on.
See you on the other side.
All right. Jesse Schuman in the house. How you doing tonight, sir?
I'm good. Brandon, Taylor, what's going on, guys? How you doing?
How's it going?
We're doing great. Thanks for coming on the show. We super appreciate it, and we've been seeing what you've been doing down there at Elevation Church, and we love it. I mean, your outreach, and Taylor will get into it more, his history. His wife, they know each other, and she couldn't talk anything better about you, about the brotherhood and what you're trying to achieve and the outreach you have within the church, and we had to get you on the show, and we're totally appreciative that you are.
Yeah, man, it's been, pretty awesome to be able to be a part of this church. It's just, I feel very thrilled to be able to call this church home and now to be able to be a pastor on staff here. It's been a crazy journey, and just to think about hearing what you guys are doing, that's so much in vein of the heart of what it is that, we're trying to promote within the men of our church. So when you guys reached out, I couldn't be more excited to be able to talk to you guys more about this tonight.
Awesome. Well, we thank you for accepting and coming onto the show. So for our listeners, if you could, tell them a little bit about yourself, your background, your testimony, what has gotten you into the church, where you're at now, and what you plan on doing, and just go from there.
Right. Yeah, man. Well, originally from Baltimore, Maryland. That's where I met Amber, Taylor's wife, and we went to the same school. Her and my sister were really good friends growing up, and so I was lucky enough to grow up in a Christian home. Well, I guess I don't know if it would technically be called a Christian home. My mom was a Christian, my dad wasn't, and so always just incredible foundations. Like my parents are both incredible people, and so went to a private Christian school, and so I was always immersed in it, but it was never really something that I really sunk my teeth into, right? It was one of those things where I'm around it all the time, and so I kind of took it for granted. And so I never really had a relationship with Christ, never really desired that. And so high school, college, definitely got into a little bit of trouble. I played, right, exactly. So it was one of those things. I played lacrosse too, and so I ended up getting recruited to play at Mount St. Mary's, which is in Western Maryland.
Yep.
And it was awesome. They're playing Hopkins right now on ESPN3. So go Mount. I don't care if we're watching later on or not. Go Mount. Let's go, boys. Lacrosse is basically like a sports fraternity. It's it doesn't exactly always promote the best values in people, but it was a good time. I had fun, and people I was around definitely encouraged the behavior. So, I'm going out and I'm trying to hook up with girls and party and just do all these kinds of things. And I just started to realize, like, it was one of those things where on paper I had everything going for me, right? So good grades, I was on the lacrosse team, like everything was going my way, but it just always left me feeling empty. That's just like a cliche thing to say, but it's so true. I felt like I had it all and yet still desired something that I couldn't put my finger on. And I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that, is this feeling of just emptiness and lack of purpose. So I just made a decision, like going into my grad school year, that I was going to just move away and just get a fresh start once I was done. I didn't know where. And so I just picked Charlotte off of the map. Kind of crazy. Like, I'd never even heard of Elevation Church, right? So at this point, I've never heard of anything. I don't even know if God's the answer. I'm running away and I'm looking for something.
I love that.
That's such a Taylor thing. Like, Taylor's so big on that type of, that's so along with lines of how Taylor would do.
Yeah. When you feel like, I'm very much an extremist.
Sure.
So I'm either all in or all out. And so when I knew I needed to like change something, I'm like, all right, well, I'm picking up and I'm completely moving. Let's go to a city where I don't know anyone, and let's just see what happens.
Wow.
And, that last year in grad school, so I made that decision going into grad school and then still had to finish up. And so as I was finishing up grad school, I just, I knew the things I was doing were wrong, but I wasn't really sure why. And so by the end of grad school, before I moved to Charlotte, I was a full-blown alcoholic. I was drinking every single night to try to numb these feelings. Like, what I was doing was wrong. I was still going out, partying, doing all this stuff, but I knew it was wrong at this point. I didn't know why, right? Like, you just have this conviction. And so that almost made it worse, is I'm like, I feel bad about what I'm doing, but I don't know why. And so it just turned into, I was just trying to numb that pain. And so, I was doing drugs and alcohol and all of that stuff. And it was just a really dark season. Like, I honestly, I lived with the same guys all throughout college. They're still some of my best friends, but I even hid that from them. I would buy a handle of whiskey and drink it in my room every night to go to sleep. And so when I moved to Charlotte, I was just like, man, I gotta make a change in my life. A very old and wise 22-year-old moving out on his own. I'm like, I'm an adult now. I got to figure these things out. So,
Sure.
So when I moved down here, I started going to a couple different churches. And then once I found Elevation, it was just so different than anything I had experienced before. The pastors rocking Jordans up on stage, and they're doing cover songs of Nirvana to start the experience. And I'm like, oh, shoot, this is not what my Catholic college was like. When I would go to mass there, it was just a lot different. So I was like, okay, I can come in and no one's looking at me for looking a little bit hungover from the night before. So I'm like, okay, I'll keep coming back to this church. I'll check this out.
Sure.
And, it's from there that I just really found a place of acceptance. I finally found a place of like belonging and purpose. I was able to get plugged in. I was able to start volunteering. I accepted Christ there. I was baptized. And like I mentioned, I'm an extremist. So when I went in, I just went all in, and that ended up leading to getting a position on staff. And so here I am, almost 6 years later in Charlotte. And I can't even believe like how great God's plan is, that he would orchestrate all of those things for someone who was just in such a dark place for so long.
Yeah.
So,
I love that.
Yeah, man. That's kind of the testimony in a nutshell for you guys. So
well, that is a heck of a story, and just like what a picture of God's redemption. That is awesome, man. Thank you so much for sharing. And like Brandon said, I can relate to that. I remember like right out of college, it was like going up to the end of my senior year, people would say like, "What are you gonna do when you graduate?" And I was like, "I don't know." And then I went away to summer staff for Young Life as soon as I graduated, which most people do like when they're still like sophomores and juniors. And then as soon as I left, I packed up and I moved to Virginia with a bag of clothes, a pillow, a box of ramen, and my Bible, and that was it. Like, I didn't even have a place. I didn't even have a place to stay. Like my brother's event, like now his like I guess aunt-in-law, I don't know, his wife's aunt let me stay there for a couple nights, and then I eventually found a place. And so being in the palm of God's provision, because you don't know, and like in your part of your story there, like not even knowing that you're really there, but being there and having him provide for you is like, I mean, I think like the sweet spot, like that's the coolest place to be. And I think we unfortunately miss that a lot here in the States.
Yeah. I think for me, looking at this, I share my testimony to encourage people in a few different ways. One is just to say, there's no low that you can get to that God can't pull you out of. There's a lot of details that I left out, a lot of different times where I could say it was the low point in my life. I had to hit rock bottom a few times. I pulled myself up and then I would nosedive back down again before God finally got hold of me. I'm a little bit stubborn, as a lot of guys can be. And with that, I just love being able to share it from the point of saying, one, like there's nothing you can do to separate yourself from the plan that God has for your life and the purpose that he has for you. It may change and it may alter, but ultimately he's going to continue to chase after you. Yeah. And that's been the coolest thing to see over these past few years. But one thing I feel like God's really been teaching me lately is I felt like for a while, I had to distance myself from my past, right? Like you have to kind of create a little bit of margin room between who you are now and who you used to be for your own sake. But to go back and to remind myself of who I used to be now at a more mature place is a healthy thing, because now I can look at, and what can I do to reach the people who are in that same position as me? What can I do to extend grace to those people and not judgment? How can I make sure someone like that, a Jesse Schuman, fresh out of college, can come to church in a way where they feel loved and not condemned, where they feel accepted and not excluded? And so that's just something I would encourage for all men to figure out, is look at your past, figure out the things that you're the least proud of. How do you use that to motivate you? How do you use that to be able to reach the people who are in that exact same position? Once you feel like you're at a place where you can proclaim what God has brought you through, and it's not a distraction for you anymore, how do you use that as leverage? As men, I love military examples, anything like that. Like the only books I read are about sports and military. So if you want anything productive, make sure you put it in those contexts. And so understanding like we're waging war against the enemy. And so using whatever weapons we can to make sure that we leverage that against them is, I just think, so important. It's something I'm so passionate about right now.
I love that. You're firing us up over here. That's awesome. Seriously. That's cool. And so with that, like you said, so your journey has taken you to a place where you get to actually, like what you just said, you're learning, you get to live that out every single day with what you're doing. So could you tell people what you're doing now at Elevation, what your role is and what you do with that?
Yeah, so I oversee all of our e-groups, which is like our small groups, our Bible studies. That's just what we call it at our main broadcast location, Ballantyne. And so it's really cool just to be able to be there, because, we get so many people from all over. We get people who have been watching our church online who want to come visit, to the person who's right down the street who just finally got sick of the traffic we create in the area and was like, let me come check this church out.
What's all this hype about?
And right. And so it's one of those things, it's so funny. A lot of times we get in this mindset that the world is supposed to like either accept the church, or when we do things as a church that we're not supposed to like mess up the status quo or anything like that. And yet you look, and the early church was often called a cult because they were so sold out to the vision of what they were doing that the world didn't understand it. And so I love being able to really invoke that passion in people to say, hey, if you don't have anyone in your life who says what you're doing, serving here, being committed here, being in a group, if you don't have anyone in your life who says that what you're doing is a little bit crazy, then I wonder, are you really living up to the potential that God has for you? That's not an excuse to go out and like pick a fight with someone, but it's just a challenge. I think as men, it's good to always challenge ourselves a little bit.
Absolutely. That's an awesome challenge. And
right. I feel like we can get behind that.
Yeah. And, Jesse, what I really love about your story is you and I kind of relate in a way of, I wasn't really brought up in a Christian home either. My mom died when I was 7 to breast cancer, and she always took us to church. As Catholics, we went on Sundays. When she died, we stopped going because, my whole family, my father and my brother and I, fought the fact that the anger with God, what people go through when they lose a loved one, and that lasted longer than it should have. But I don't look back in any regret. So it's been a few years now since I came to grow my relationship with God and where I'm at. So I love hearing your testimony, and I know our listeners will as well, because all of our listeners, not every single one of them came from a Christian home. So they cannot all relate to, for instance, like Taylor. Taylor did. And then that's what I think makes Taylor and I's relationship so well, is that I did not and he did. So we can bounce things off of each other and see things from those two different points of view. So our listeners, hearing that from someone like you, who is huge in the church now and has accepted Christ and has just walked away with just so many things and better life and better future, just everything that you've gotten from that, they can now listen to that as someone just like you and I, and maybe where they're at now, fighting it and trying to figure out what they want to do and what they want to believe in. And they can listen to this podcast and listen to this interview and say, hey, I'm not alone. You know what I mean? Like, they don't have to sit there and be worried about what people are going to, like you said, you don't want to judge anybody. You don't want that judgment to fall on them, because you were once in their shoes, as was I, and as were half of our listeners probably. So thank you for sharing that, like, super deep material and background of your life that you didn't have to, but you putting it out for our listeners and Taylor and I was just amazing, and we appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things. Being around the church for a few years now, it's been incredible for me just to be able to see how many different backgrounds and different stories people come from, right? And so, whether you were raised in a Christian home and, never went off and got a little crazy in college, or you're someone like me who by the end of college, you have no idea what you're doing with your life. It's one of those things that I've started to realize one of the greatest tools that the enemy's going to use is isolation. And so he's always going to try to convince us that our story is so unique that no one can relate. And what we've been through is so different that no one understands it. And so as men, I think we need to just take back control of our minds a little bit sometimes and just say, no, there are people who have been through what I've been through. And it's all about making a decision. And I can say this with full confidence because it took me hitting rock bottom multiple times. And then even since I accepted Christ, it's not like it's been a cakewalk. I mean, 2 weeks after I was baptized was one of the worst weekends of my life, of just filled with sin and regret. And yet I just continued to march forward through that. And so I think for us, like, one of the things that I've found is most helpful for men is just to be open about these things and to realize, like, no matter what it is that you've been through. I mean, like you were just saying, losing your mother at such a young age, my gosh, I can't even imagine that. But here's the thing, like, regardless of the pain that we face, regardless of the consequences of what our actions may be, regardless of any of these things, like, it doesn't change the way that God views us. And if we can be around people who can remind us of that and who can constantly encourage and pull the best out of us, it's like, man, it doesn't matter what you go through or what the world throws at you, you can handle it, because, like, as men, God's equipped us to be able to do that, not by our own merit, but by sharing those things with him. And so I love being able just to hear different guys, different backgrounds, because at the end of the day, like, what we're able to do with our lives all comes down to a decision. Are we going to press in? Are we going to be able to continue to marching forward? Are we going to be able to make a decision to put Christ first in our lives? And not put our own desires first. And that's a hard thing to do, to fall on that sword. But understanding that there's a lot of guys out there with similar backgrounds, with similar stories, I think is just so encouraging. That's why I love this podcast, is it's getting guys to open up. It's getting them to think. It's getting them to hear different perspectives, just to be able to challenge the way the world would tell us just to hold those thoughts, hold those feelings to yourself. You're all alone. No one else feels this way. No one else has feelings, right? Like, that's what I think. This is awesome what you guys are doing here.
Well, we appreciate that. And that's exactly what the next point I was going into was the fact of what you said earlier is guys typically don't want to open up. And that's what we're trying to do. And that's where Taylor and I saw that gap. And then why we created Brothers of Merit was the fact that guys weren't opened up. And we want them to seek that brotherhood and to be able to open up to God, open up to those brothers, and then to encourage each other to, one, walk and look like Jesus every day, but by doing that, doing it in unity with each other and as a brotherhood. So on that Brotherhood Talk, because of what you do with the church and your past, can you give us any advice or any stories or any experience you've had with brotherhood that could really help our listeners out and Taylor and I?
Yeah, I think, the thing that stands out the most to me in my entire journey, walk, relationship, whatever you want to call it, my entire time that I've been a Christian, the thing that has been the most helpful for me, and I know this isn't going to be a practical thing for everyone, but the principle still applies, is when I was going through all this, I was living with two other guys at the time. So again, we're fresh out of college. We get a house right in Charlotte, and it was just awesome. But the thing that was awesome about it was that we were all on the same page. We were all new believers. And what I learned in that house isn't that you need to live with other guys to have this kind of growth, but was to understand through that, by surrounding myself with other people, it challenged me daily. My gosh, the three of us could not be more different and yet more similar. And what I realized was, just like in a marriage or any sort of relationship, like it takes work. Communication doesn't happen by accident. And you have to be intentional about seeking it. You have to carve that time out. Like, you have to make sure that you are prioritizing not just the other person, but yourself, right? I'm sure you guys can both relate to, if you hold on to things for too long, all that that's going to do is build up resentment in the relationship, and the other person doesn't even know about it. And I realized that same thing by living with these two guys, was that I had to constantly challenge myself to open up, to share what was going on, because, scripture tells us iron sharpens iron. And that was really what I found in that house. The most impactful thing I've had in my entire journey of being a Christian was being with other guys who forced me to be vulnerable, who asked me what was going on, who put me in positions where we would pray for one another. We would challenge one another. And so for whatever that may look like for whoever's listening to this, find some way to put yourself in community with people who are headed in the same direction, who want the same things with their life. It may look a little bit different. If you may be just starting to go to church, or you've been in church for a while and are looking for a kickstart, like, find a group of guys who are going to challenge your mindset, who are going to challenge the way you think, because through that friction, you're really able to forge something that's worthwhile. And so whether that be you've been in church for years and just never joined a small group, or you've been in a small group, but maybe it's time for you to lead one, or maybe you just need to find a different group of guys that are in a more similar state of life than you. I think it's so important for guys to be able to put themselves in a position where they're around other men who aren't afraid to call them on their BS, to push them a little bit, to challenge them, but then to also commit to that. It's so easy for guys to feel like we give so much at work and we give so much in the home that we don't have anything else to give, that we're leaders in all these other areas. And so I don't need to go and talk about feelings. I don't need to go surround myself with other men. But to me, that's where I've seen the most growth in my life.
That's awesome. I was about to ask you, do you have any advice for the people listening on how they can find that or what they need to be looking for? And you just nailed it. So that's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, I think most people have, at their church, opportunities. I truly believe that, God calls us to be rooted, to be planted somewhere. And nowadays, with how prevalent church online is, a lot of churches, I know our church as well, is even doing things to make sure, like, hey, you can't just tune in without hearing about ways to get connected. Like, we have online e-groups and Bible studies now. And that's not a plug for my church. What I'm saying is there's really just no excuse. Well, okay, maybe it's a shameless plug, but that's only for people who don't have their own church. If you have a church that you're committed to, like, challenge yourself to have a conversation with one of the pastors there, to talk to one of the staff, to figure out how can you get more involved, and then commit to that. Like actually show up, actually make it a priority. Just like you would, working out or whatever other thing is a priority in your life, make sure to challenge yourself, commit yourself, get a whiteboard and write out how many times you're going to go before you're allowed to miss. Like, I think goal setting and challenging ourselves as men is such a pivotal part of who we are, that when you just kind of let life happen by accident, you lose a little bit of that, like, I don't know, that intensity, that challenge that I think that God has instilled in a lot of us.
No, that's amazing. And that's fine. Go ahead and shameless plug it, because that's awesome. That's exactly what we should be doing. Like, and like for real, like, we have a home church. Like, we both go to Crossroads here in Carroll County.
Yeah.
And it's part of it is I've actually been having conversations with our pastor, who's going to be coming up on a future episode here, about the importance of the church being kind of digital, and because we live in a digital age. And and sometimes churches think that just means you have to live feed and then have a Twitter handle, or whatever.
Yeah,
but like actually engaging in that is huge. I get a ton of, I was literally looking at Elevation Church on Instagram today. Like when like there's a thing that said, God is not intimidated by what makes me insecure. Like that's awesome. And even if it's just like something when I'm scrolling, and that's like an encouraging, like, so like I said, go ahead and plug it, because that's incredible, and that's exactly what we should be doing. And if you don't have a home church, like, and you're listening to this, then check it out. Like, we'll put that in the past guests tab on our website. We'll put that in the show description. Like, that's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what's so important about this, like, again, since you brought up it's okay to plug, I'm going to shoot my shot here. But one of the things that I saw from this was all like things that I felt when I was newer in my faith, and I was trying to really discover what my identity looked like, because there's so many, like, when you get into the Christian world, I love what a lot of like the quote unquote more mainstream or mega churches are doing, which is to stay relevant with the world. I believe that the church is called to reach people where they're at. And in no way does that mean that you're continuing to read the New King James Version. Like, New King James is still King James. If you get up there and that's all you're doing to excite your service or excite things going on in your church, you're missing the whole point. Like, we're supposed to be able to go out and be relevant in the world. That doesn't mean sacrificing your convictions or sacrificing your belief, but like, ministry should be fun. Ministry should be enjoyed. Like, 100%. Not to say that it shouldn't be hard. Trust me, being a Christian is difficult, but if you have no joy, if you have no excitement in what you're doing, it's like, man, God doesn't call you for that. Like, look around, look at a rainbow. Clearly God like enjoys life and enjoys what he gives us. And so what I thought was so cool that our church started to do was really figuring out, like you said, streaming an experience or a worship or a service online is such the bare minimum. Now, yeah, you can do that to supplement things. Like, if you want to listen to an extra podcast or sermon on your way to work, that's great. That's better than most of the stuff you're going to hear on the radio. But if you don't have a church and that's what you consider church, there are other options. Like, we've done a lot to really try to innovate. How do we make sure we steward what God has entrusted to us, right? Like, we were blessed to have a lot of people tune in to watch our experiences online. And so we had to really gut check ourselves to say, okay, well, what are we going to do with those people? It's not enough for them to just tune in and then tune out. They're from all over the world. If we have to assume that a lot of those people don't live close enough to a church that they can call home, how are we going to engage them? And so we've done a lot to really make sure that, we have chat rooms available for people to connect with. And we have staff who have discussions after every sermon. And we push online e-groups that either meet in person in different areas or over Skype. And so I'm using that less to talk about elevation and more to talk about the way the church should operate. 100%. Is different churches are called for different things. But the one thing that we're not called to do, any church, is to stay stuck in the past. And so as men, I think it's so important for us, again, the leaders that God naturally designed us to be, whether you're on staff or not, to be a part of your church, to help integrate and innovate at your church and really continue to push things forward. Like, Crossroads, I've been there a handful of times when I was back home, and it's a great church. But if it was the same church 10 years ago as it is today, it's like, man, like, what are we doing here? How are we making sure we're going out and we're challenging and we're reaching different sets of people? It's not enough to have the same 500 people at church 10 years ago as we have today. And I just think as men, we need to take ownership of that. We need to take back fighting for the local church. That's what Christ came here for. So as you can tell, I get passionate about that. I could keep going all night. But.
No, it's fine to get, believe it or not, Taylor and I were just talking about that type of thing before we got you onto the interview, was that if we, had the same exact people coming to church all the time, but we could say, hey, next year we brought in like 5,000 different people into Crossroads, whether it was digitally, like we were just talking about a few minutes ago, or in person, it's still doing what we're trying to achieve and what God wants us to achieve, and that is to spread the gospel and to spread his word. So that's exactly what, at the end of the day, that's what we're all trying to do. And to kind of wrap it up here, I want to end with basically the question that I ask every person that's on our show, and that is, what pure advice, coming from Jesse, what advice can you give to all of our listeners, to Taylor and myself, about brotherhood? Like, just deep down, true grit style information and advice. What can you give us? Yeah,
I think that's so great. And especially in light of the way the world portrays a man, right? It's all lumberjacks and cowboys and no feelings, no emotions. It's all about how many women you can get and what your bank account looks like. And I just think the thing that I would say over everything is, if you want a strong and a thriving relationship with Christ, where you have peace in your life, and I don't mean peace because you don't have debt. I mean peace because no matter what your circumstances look like, you can have that peace and assurance to know where your place in eternity is secured, is you have to take ownership. You can't sit back and wait for these things to happen. I think it's so important for men to have that fighter mentality, right? Yeah. To have that competitive edge. And I think it looks different. I'm a former athlete. And so for me, I can relate to any sports thing, but I think inherently every single man out there has some level of fight in them, where whatever it is, whether it's work is too stressful, or you feel like your wife doesn't listen, or you don't have any friends, or whatever it is, you don't get the promotion at work. It's so easy for us to just get in a routine of just monotony, a routine of complacency. And so I would just say you have to take ownership, whatever that looks like. I love challenging myself. Like I said, I have a whiteboard in my room I'm constantly writing new challenges up there for, but whatever that looks like for you, just take ownership. Maybe it's just getting up in the morning and reading one proverb a day. Do something to take control of your day. Don't just let life happen to you. You need to take some ownership. And so that's the one thing that I would say is, especially reaching such a broad audience, is I don't know where everyone's at, but wherever you're at in your life, there's something that as men, we can always take more ownership in. Wow. That's amazing. That's awesome advice. I love the whiteboard, and, even reading the Proverbs, just one a day, the wisdom that you can take out of that. You know what I mean? That's amazing. And you're the first person to tell us about the whiteboard. And I think that's actually a pretty cool idea, because if you visually see something, you know what I mean, and you can actually visually track it, it goes better. I think sometimes, like, people sometimes need the visual side of things to actually track themselves and make sure they stay on pace. Others may not, but if you're that type of man that needs that, to our listeners, hey, there's some advice that I think may help. Yeah, that's huge. Right. I just think men are so visually stimulated. Yeah. Normally that's used to get us in trouble. So why not take that and use it in a positive? And I just think a whiteboard's so cool. I mean, you can do week challenges at a time, monthly ones, quarterly, whatever, but I just love to keep it fresh. I love to make sure that I'm always mixing it up and just challenging myself. Like I said, taking ownership of my life, even when things feel out of control. What's one thing that I can challenge myself for this week, this month, whatever. So I think find something like that and just run with it. Do whatever you feel passionate about for it. That's awesome. We love that, Jesse. And once again,
we thank you for coming onto the show. I know our listeners are going to love this episode. Taylor and I, throughout the whole thing, we're just looking at each other, shaking our heads like, this is the material and this is the content that our men need to hear. Like, this is it. Like, you didn't hold back, and you said things that just needed to be said, like real stuff, not just things that we're trying to make people want to hear. Like, you said it, and we appreciate that because some men just need to hear it. Like, no sugarcoating, just straight up, hey, I've battled with this. I've gotten through it. God's been with me. This is how you do it, and it can be done. So thank you. We both needed that just as much as you have in the past and just as much as our listeners do. So thank you.
Yeah, and that's what I was just about to say. We know it's going to connect with our listeners because it connected with us. Like, that fired me up, man. I'm pumped. That was awesome.
Yeah, well, thank you. It was definitely, I had to check myself a few times there and be like, yeah, you got to get back on track with some of those things. But again, talking to men, just like we're doing tonight, this is what's important, is having that. So yeah, I would just encourage anyone, find that group, find that community, find your tribe, make sure that you're constantly challenging yourself, and don't get complacent with life. Again, take it by the horns, as men, I think we're called to do that. So yeah, hopefully tonight was helpful.
It was, Jesse, and we appreciate it, and we definitely hope to talk to you soon, okay?
Yeah, thanks, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you guys for having me.
Yes, sir. You take care, okay?
All right.
Alrighty. Alrighty, so there you have it, guys. There was Jesse Schuman from Elevation Church. We enjoyed it, we loved it, and we took a lot away from it, and I know you guys probably did as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you heard anything in the background, but it was tons of just fist pumps and just like fired up, like, yes, this is awesome. I love hearing this. So I'm sure that's where you're at right now.
Yep. Heck yeah. So next week we have Legacy Dads, Lance and Dante. We're super looking forward to that. Those guys were ranked #1 in Christian Men's Podcast in 2018 on iTunes. So they're currently now still within the top hundreds. Like, they're amazing, and we love listening to them, and we can't wait to interview them.
Yeah, absolutely. So make sure you check their podcast out. We'll be on their episode next week. They're coming on our episode next week. So go find them on where you get your podcasts, and we'll see you next week.
All right.
See ya.
See ya.